The morning they broke ground, I was standing on the ridge above Miller Creek, coffee in hand, silence in my chest. Below me, machines the color of mustard and steel were crawling across what used to be my pasture. The valley echoed with the hum of diesel engines and the rhythmic clang of metal teeth biting into the earth. Dust rose in lazy spirals, catching the early sunlight like smoke. It was the same land my father and his father had plowed, the same soil that carried the weight of my family's footsteps for nearly a century. 53 acres of grass, water, and history, all of it now claimed by a homeowners association I'd never agreed to join. They called it community expansion. I called it theft. I'd fought it, of course. Letters, calls, hearings, all of it ignored. The HOA's lawyers had buried me under paperwork so thick it could have built a wall. Then one day, a county clerk's notice arrived saying my parcel was reclassified for urban development. The words were sterile, clinical, as if they hadn't just rewritten my family's history with the stroke of a pen. And so they began. 15 commercial buildings, offices, storefronts, and parking lots, rising one after another like weeds after a rainstorm. From the ridge, I watched their empire take shape. Bulldozers flattened the orchard where my father used to rest his tools. Surveyors planted neon-orange flags across the fields like little claims of victory. And in the middle of it all, a tall, glass-walled structure started to climb toward the sky, the so-called Cedar Summit Business Center. Every few weeks, I'd come back. Just to watch. Just to remember. I kept my visits short, long enough to see progress, short enough not to be noticed. The workers thought I was a passerby. They nodded sometimes, polite but indifferent. I nodded back, a ghost wandering the edges of my own grave. The first time I saw Richard Keene, the HOA president, he was wearing a hard hat and sunglasses, pointing toward blueprints spread over a truck hood. He was a man who smiled only when others couldn't answer back. His voice carried even over the machinery, smooth, confident, full of the kind of power that thinks it's permanent. When our eyes met, I don't think he knew who I was. To him, I was just another local watching progress unfold, another obstacle already conquered. I didn't correct him. Not yet. It took me months to accept it, the idea that my land was gone. Every instinct screamed to fight, to shout, to burn every document they'd filed. But something in me knew better. My father's words came back to me. A fool strikes while the enemy's awake. A patient man waits for silence. So I waited. I let them finish their first foundation. I let them install the water lines that fed off my creek. I even let them pave the access road that cut right across my southern lot. Each time, it hurt. Watching that land change shape felt like watching a body rot, slow, inevitable. But with every new brick they laid, I felt something else building too. A plan. I started collecting things, copies of deeds, county records, old property surveys my grandfather had signed by hand in 1957. I dug through archives until my fingers ached from turning yellowed pages. Late nights blurred into early mornings, the glow of my desk lamp the only witness. And then I found it, buried in an old drawer of my father's roll-top desk. A warranty deed from 1983, notarized, sealed, and never contested. My father's signature. My grandfather's stamp. And right below it, the phrase that made my heart stop for a moment. Easement rights retained in perpetuity by the Holland family for all land water access and subterranean foundation beneath parcel 9 through 15. In simple words, they'd built their empire on the one thing they didn't own. The realization hit me like thunder. The HOA's entire development, 15 buildings, all commercial, sat on land that touched my family's subterranean water rights. Every pipe, every drain, every utility line ran through soil that was still legally mine. They hadn't taken my land. They'd built on top of it. And that meant one thing: they owed me. Not in words. Not in apologies. But in law. I didn't move fast. The trick was patience, the kind that eats through time like water through stone. The buildings rose. Shiny new offices filled with tenants. Real estate signs went up. Lawyers and bankers toasted champagne under glass ceilings built over stolen ground. The HOA had no idea. They thought I'd vanished. But I was there, watching. I remember one particular evening. Late autumn. The business park lights shimmered across the parking lots like constellations. I stood at the creek's edge, listening to the water run beneath their structures, the same water they'd rerouted illegally. It whispered to me like an old friend. Not yet, it seemed to say. Let them finish. The next spring, I got a notice in the mail, from the HOA, of all people. It was a trespass violation warning. Apparently, someone had reported a man loitering near the Cedar Summit properties. The notice warned of legal action if I entered community grounds again. I laughed until I cried. They were warning me off my own land. I pinned the notice to my wall and circled one phrase in red ink: legal action. Fine. I'd give them legal action. Just not the kind they expected. By summer, all 15 buildings were complete. The grand opening made the papers, smiling executives cutting ribbons, local politicians shaking hands, the HOA bragging about economic growth. The very next week, I filed a claim with the county clerk's office. Not a complaint. Not a lawsuit. A deed enforcement action. It was quiet, simple, and devastating. A single document, referencing easement rights and subterranean ownership, cross-filed with property titles for each of the 15 structures. I didn't need to tell them what it meant. The paperwork would do it for me. Because buried beneath their parking lots, under their concrete foundations, beneath their polished offices, was land they didn't own, water they didn't control, and a man they thought they'd erased. I wasn't coming to take revenge. I was coming to reclaim what was already mine. The county clerk's office is a quiet place on most days, the kind of quiet that swallows the sound of your shoes. The day my filing hit their system, that silence cracked like glass. By the time the HOA board noticed, the damage was already done. My claim wasn't a complaint or a petition, it was a legal stake driven straight through their foundation. Within 72 hours, 15 property titles were flagged for review. The county's assessor's office froze all commercial transactions involving the development. Rent payments to the HOA's shell company were placed in escrow pending clarification of ownership. In other words, their money stopped moving. And when money stops, people start to panic. On the third morning after the filing, I found a car waiting near my gate. A sleek black sedan, polished enough to show the clouds drifting above. 2 men stepped out, one in a charcoal suit, the other carrying a briefcase like it contained a bomb. "Mr. Harlan?" the taller one asked. "Depends who's asking." He smiled thinly. "Richard Keene, president of the Ridgeview Homeowners Association." Of course it was. The same man I'd seen months ago, barking orders over blueprints like a self-appointed king. "And this," he said, gesturing to the shorter man, "is our counsel, Mr. Lowe." Lowe nodded stiffly. His tie was crooked, his smile wasn't. "We'd like to speak about a certain document you filed with the county." I gestured toward the porch. "You can speak. Doesn't mean I'll listen." Keene's smirk faltered. "Mr. Harlan, you must realize how serious this is. You can't just waltz into the clerk's office and start claiming easements that don't exist." "I didn't claim anything," I said, sipping my coffee. "I enforced what already belonged to me." Lowe cleared his throat, flipping through the folder. "Our records show." "Your records," I interrupted, "aren't law. The county's are. And those show easement rights established in 1983, reaffirmed by water usage permits in 1998, and left unchallenged for 40 years. You built over them. That's your mistake, not mine." Keene's jaw tightened. "This development cost millions. You can't just sabotage." "Sabotage?" I laughed softly. "I let you finish your buildings, Mr. Keene. I didn't lift a finger. You sabotaged yourselves when you built on land you never owned." For a moment, no one spoke. The wind moved through the trees behind us, rustling leaves like paper whispers. Lowe adjusted his tie. "We're prepared to make this right," he said carefully. Perhaps some kind of settlement. I'm not selling, I said. Not renting. Not negotiating. Keen's composure cracked then. You can't stop commerce, Harlan. You think you'll win? The courts won't side with you. I met his eyes. You sure you want to test that theory? He blinked. Why wouldn't I? I smiled, cold and quiet. Because I spent 20 years sitting on the other side of that bench. The realization dawned slowly, like a storm spreading through his face. You're... Yes, I said. The Honorable Judge Harlan. Retired. 9th District Court. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, the kind that bends the air. Keen took a half step back, words dying in his throat. Lowe shut the folder without looking at me. You'll be hearing from our attorneys, Keen muttered finally. I look forward to it, I said. It's been a while since I've had a good laugh. They left without shaking hands. That night, I sat by the window watching headlights crawl down the road toward the new complex. 15 buildings lit up like monuments to greed, glass and steel pretending to be permanence. They didn't know it yet, but those lights were running on borrowed ground. By the end of the week, their panic was public. Tenants began receiving letters from the county auditor's office, informing them that their lease payments were being held pending a property ownership review. The local paper picked it up, Dispute over Land Rights Freezes Cedar Summit Development. The headline didn't use my name, but everyone in town knew who I was. Phones started ringing. Real estate investors, lenders, insurance representatives, all looking for answers. The HOA tried to keep it quiet, but you can't hide a bleeding wound. And then, on a Monday morning, I received a visit I hadn't expected, from the county commissioner herself, Janet Wilkes. She arrived without entourage or warning, driving a dusty silver truck. She stepped out, clipboard in hand, a look of exhaustion on her face. "Morning, Judge," she said. "Mind if I come in?" We sat on the porch. I poured her coffee. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. "You know you caused a small earthquake downtown, right?" "I heard a few tremors," I said. "You've got 15 businesses in limbo and 3 banks ready to pull funding from the HOA's next project. They're calling it a land seizure." I shook my head. "They seized mine first. I just took back what they never owned." Janet sighed. "I've seen the paperwork. You're technically right, those easement rights were never nullified. But this is going to turn ugly. The HOA's lobbying hard to invalidate the claim. They've got money and friends." "So do I," I said quietly. "I've got the truth, and time." She gave a tired smile. "You always were stubborn." "Persistent," I corrected. She chuckled, standing up. "Well, I hope persistence pays, Judge. Because you've just turned half the county's money men into your enemies." "Wouldn't be the first time." That evening, my phone rang again, an unknown number. When I answered, a voice on the other end said, "You should drop the claim, old man. You don't know who you're fighting." I didn't respond. Just listened to the faint hum of the line until the caller hung up. I turned off the light, sat by the window again, and looked at the glow of the business park in the distance. They'd built their fortress, but the foundation was mine. They could threaten me all they wanted, but threats are just noise. Paper, though, paper is power. And I had all the right ones. By the following week, the HOA filed an injunction to halt my claim. Their attorneys packed the courthouse, cameras swarmed the steps, and people whispered words like fraud, retaliation, and revenge. But I didn't attend the hearing. Not yet. Let them play defense. Let them bleed money. Let them drown in the paperwork they once used to bury me. They thought they'd built on solid ground. But I knew better. They'd built on borrowed time. And the clock had just started ticking. By the time the court date arrived, Ridgeview's empire had already begun to crack. Tenants were leaving. The bank had suspended loan guarantees. Investors were quietly calling it what it was, a mess. But for me, the real battle wasn't about money anymore. It was about memory, about proving that the soil beneath those 15 glittering buildings still remembered whose hands had shaped it first. The courthouse steps were a battlefield of flashing cameras that morning. Reporters swarmed like flies, microphones outstretched, shouting questions as I walked past in my old brown suit. "Judge Harlan, is it true you're suing the HOA that took your property? Do you plan to take ownership of the commercial buildings? Are you seeking damages?" I said nothing. The truth didn't need noise. It just needed time. Inside, the air buzzed with the kind of tension you could feel in your bones. The HOA's legal team occupied one table, 4 attorneys, 3 paralegals, and a nervous-looking Richard Keene clutching a stack of papers like a life vest. His tie was perfect, but his eyes were glassy, darting to the exits as if they might still offer escape. The judge assigned to the case, Honorable Patricia Ellison, was sharp, calm, and famously immune to theatrics. She adjusted her glasses, glanced down at the file, and said, "Let's begin." The HOA's lead attorney, Marcus Lowe, launched into his opening statement like a man sprinting uphill. "Your Honor, the defendant, Mr. Harlan, has filed an illegitimate claim intended solely to disrupt lawful business operations. The HOA rightfully obtained development rights through county-approved reclassification, and his actions constitute—" "Stop," Judge Ellison said, holding up a hand. "You said lawfully obtained. I see no deed transfers in this file confirming ownership." Lowe hesitated, then shuffled his papers. "That's because the property was zoned as shared commercial land under an amendment filed by the HOA itself," I interjected. "An amendment the county never ratified." Lowe glared at me. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Harlan." I smiled slightly. I already had it, 40 years ago, when my family recorded the original deed. The gallery murmured. Judge Ellison turned to me. "Mr. Harlan, are you representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." She nodded. "Proceed." I rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in that room. For a long second, I said nothing. Then I walked to the evidence table and laid out 3 faded documents, sealed in plastic sleeves. "This," I said, tapping the first, "is the original deed, dated 1983, granting my family full subterranean and waterway easement rights beneath parcels 9 through 15, the land on which the Ridgeview Business Complex now stands." A murmur rippled through the court. "This," I continued, holding up the second, "is the 1998 hydrological assessment, confirming those water rights still active and legally protected under county law." I laid down the third paper. "And this is the HOA's development permit. Note the signatures. Not a single acknowledgement of prior easement rights, despite that clause being required by statute." I looked up at the judge. "They built their foundation on stolen ground." Lowe recovered quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. That's an inflammatory accusation." "Overruled," Judge Ellison said. "Continue, Mr. Harlan." I turned back to the room. "They didn't just take my land. They ignored the law, bypassed the county, and filed fraudulent paperwork to cover it up. They did all this because they assumed nobody would notice. But they forgot one thing." I paused, letting the silence breathe. "I helped write that law." The air in the room changed. Lowe blinked. "You, what?" "I was on the county's advisory board in 1998, I said calmly. "I helped draft revisions to Section 23B, the same statute governing property reclassification. I know every loophole, every line, every signature it requires. And they didn't follow a single one." Gasps broke across the gallery like ripples on water. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. Lowe's composure cracked. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant." "It's entirely relevant," Judge Ellison said sharply. "Mr. Harlan's testimony establishes material knowledge of statutory procedure. Continue." Lowe sank back into his chair. I approached the bench and handed up a small, weathered notebook. "My father's," I said softly. "He kept a log of every land survey, every boundary, every deal he ever made. The last entry is dated the week before the HOA filed their zoning claim. It reads, and I quote, "Let them build if they must. The land will remember." I looked up. I think he was right. When the lunch recess came, the courtroom felt like a live wire. Reporters dashed out to broadcast every revelation. Even the bailiff whispered to another officer, "He's burying them alive." Across the aisle, Richard Keene sat pale and sweating. His lawyers crowded him, voices low and frantic. I didn't need to hear what they said, I could see it in their faces. They were bleeding credibility, and they knew it. After recess, the judge called both parties back. "Mr. Lowe," she said, "I've reviewed the county's record and Mr. Harlan's documentation. It appears the Ridgeview HOA knowingly built on land subject to active easement protections. Care to explain?" Lowe's throat bobbed. We relied on previous filings. There was no indication." "There was every indication," she cut in. "You simply didn't look. Or didn't care." She turned to me. "Mr. Harlan, your claim stands. Do you wish to pursue restitution?" I took a deep breath. "No, Your Honor. I don't want their money. I just want my land, every inch of it, restored under my family's name." Keene jumped up, red-faced. You can't just take it all back. We built that land up from nothing." I looked at him. "From my nothing, Mr. Keene." Judge Ellison raised the gavel. "The court finds that the HOA's actions constitute unlawful occupation of private land. All 15 properties are to be placed under immediate injunction pending transfer of deed ownership back to the Harlan estate. The HOA will vacate within 30 days." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Case closed. Reporters flooded forward, shouting my name. I didn't stop. I walked straight out of the courtroom into the sunlight, the noise fading behind me. Across the street, I could see the business park glittering on the horizon, glass towers standing proud and hollow. I knew what came next: appeals, negotiations, maybe settlements. But none of it mattered. The ground was mine again. The fight was over. And for the first time in years, the land beneath my feet felt steady. The news spread like fire in dry grass. Within 48 hours, every local channel was running the headline: "Judge wins back land after HOA builds 15 structures on his property." Some called me brilliant. Others called me ruthless. I wasn't either. I was just patient. For weeks, reporters camped at the end of my road. Helicopters hovered low enough to shake the trees. The phone never stopped ringing: journalists, lawyers, developers, even old friends who suddenly remembered my number. But through all of it, the only sound I cared about was the wind moving across my fields again. The same wind my father used to listen to before storms. The sound of something old, something permanent. The land was finally breathing again. When the court order took effect, the Ridgeview Business Park went silent overnight. The parking lots emptied. Storefronts closed. Construction halted. I drove through the area once, just to see it, 15 empty shells gleaming in the sunlight like monuments to arrogance. At one point, I stopped near Building 9, the largest one, the one that sat directly over the old well. My father had dug that well by hand 50 years ago. Now the well cap sat hidden under polished tile and foundation steel. For a moment, I stood there, listening to the silence. Then I laughed. They'd tried to bury our history. They'd only managed to build a shrine on top of it. A month later, I received a formal notice from the county. All properties have been reclassified and deeds reassigned to the Harlan estate per judicial order. Attached were 15 separate documents, each bearing the same phrase: legal ownership restored. I laid them out across my dining table, a long wooden slab my father built from a cedar tree that once stood in the east field. The papers glowed under the lamplight, white against the dark wood. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance. One evening, there was a knock at my door. It was Richard Keene. He looked smaller, not in size, but in weight. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something almost human. "Judge Harlan," he said quietly, I just wanted to apologize. I didn't speak. He swallowed hard. I thought power meant control. But it doesn't, does it? It just makes you blind. I studied him for a long moment. You didn't steal my land because you needed it, I said softly. You did it because you thought you could. He nodded slowly. And you let me. I did, I said. Because sometimes the best way to teach a man his wrong is to let him finish the mistake. He looked down, then extended his hand. I hesitated, then shook it. No forgiveness. No friendship. Just closure. He turned to leave. Before he reached his car, I said, Mr. Keene. He stopped. You built 15 monuments to greed, I said. Now make sure they don't rot. Do something useful with them. He nodded once, silently, and drove away. For months, I worked with the county and a few local organizations to repurpose the buildings. 5 became community centers. 3 turned into low-cost offices for small businesses. 2 became schools. The rest were converted into storage and municipal facilities. Not a single cent of rent went to the HOA. Every lease, every partnership, every contract carried my family name, Holland Land Trust. It wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about restoration. One late summer evening, I walked the length of the property, from the creek to the ridge. The grass had started to return. The scent of wet soil and cedar hung in the air. The old irrigation channels were still there, hidden under weeds, waiting for water again. I reached the top of the hill, where my grandfather's fence post still leaned at an angle. The sun dipped low, painting everything gold. From up there, the 15 buildings looked small, almost fragile. Time had a way of humbling everything built on borrowed ground. When autumn came, I decided to rebuild the farmhouse. Not the big modern kind, just a simple one, like the one I grew up in. I used the old blueprints from my father's trunk. Neighbors came to help, the same people who once avoided me during the lawsuit. Some brought tools, some brought food. Nobody asked for payment. On the last day of construction, an old man from town, Mr. Lambert, handed me a small wooden sign. It read, "The land remembers." I nailed it to the front porch myself. That night, I sat on the steps, listening to the crickets. The air was cool, and the stars were clear. Down in the valley, I could still see faint reflections from the empty office windows, the ghosts of ambition flickering in the dark. For the first time in years, I felt peace. Not because I'd won, but because the land had. Weeks later, a letter arrived from the county commissioner, Janet Wilkes. It was short and handwritten. "You were right, Judge. Patience is louder than power." I smiled, folded it, and placed it inside the deed folder, right next to my father's old warranty document. Sometimes I drive past the new community center that used to be Building 9. The kids play outside on the same ground where bulldozers once tore the earth apart. The water fountain they drink from? Fed by the same old well my father dug. When I watch them run and laugh, I hear my father's voice again. "The land doesn't belong to us, son. We belong to it." He was right. The HOA had built their monuments to pride. I had rebuilt mine to purpose. And in the end, the land itself delivered the verdict no court ever could. 5 years have passed since the verdict. Seasons have come and gone, each one gentler than the last. The scars on the land have healed, the grass is thicker, the soil darker, the water clearer. The noise of bulldozers and legal battles has been replaced by something far rarer, silence. The Ridgeview grounds, once a battlefield of greed and ambition, now hum with life again. Children run through the open fields where parking lots once stretched. Wildflowers creep through cracks in old pavement, painting the earth with the colors of forgiveness. Sometimes, when I walk those paths, I can almost hear the echoes of the past, the engines, the shouting, the paper wars. But they are faint now, like an old dream. The land has moved on. And so have I. I kept only one of the original 15 buildings, the first one they finished, Building 1. It stands on a small rise overlooking the creek, its glass facade reflecting the hills beyond. I turned it into a public library. Inside, The air smells of cedar and ink. Shelves built from repurposed oak beams hold books on law, history, and the stories of this valley. I donated my father's and grandfather's journals to a small exhibit in the back, along with the original deeds that started it all. The sign at the entrance reads, Harlan Library, where the land speaks. Sometimes I sit there, behind the reference desk, pretending to be another old man reading. Visitors don't recognize me anymore. To them, I'm just part of the story on the wall, a name tied to a legend about patience and justice. That's fine by me. Every autumn, the local school brings children for field trips. I listen from a distance as teachers tell the story of the man who waited. They talk about law, fairness, and courage. But that's not the real story. The truth is simpler. It's about listening. To the land. To time. To silence. The land had spoken long before any judge or jury did. I just happened to hear it clearly enough to act. Last winter, I received a letter from Richard Keene, the man who once stood at the center of everything I lost. The envelope was plain, the handwriting careful. It read, Judge Harlan, I wanted you to know that I've started a small business, land restoration and waterway management. I guess I learned something from what happened. You were right. We don't own the land, we borrow it. I hope you're well. Richard. I sat for a long time holding that letter. Then I smiled. Maybe redemption doesn't come from courts or contracts. Maybe it comes from understanding the weight of what you've broken and fixing it with your own hands. The town changed, too. The new Ridgeview Community Council, formed after the HOA collapsed, runs things now. No more hidden amendments, no secret votes, no fines for grass height or mailbox color. Decisions are made on folding chairs in an open hall with lemonade and laughter. Sometimes they invite me to speak at meetings. I always decline. I tell them the same thing every time. If you want to honor this land, don't let power make you deaf. They usually nod, not fully understanding. But someday, they will. On summer nights, when the fireflies rise and the creek glows silver under the moon, I sit on my porch and watch the horizon. The buildings shimmer faintly in the distance, quiet now, tamed by time and purpose. I often think of my father. He used to tell me, the land has its own memory, son. It forgets the footprints but keeps the lessons. I didn't understand that back then. Now I do. A few months ago, the State Historical Society approached me. They wanted to designate the valley as a heritage site, not because of the battle or the court case, but because of what came after. The Harlan Valley Project, they call it now, a place where nature reclaimed progress, where law and legacy found balance. They asked me to cut the ribbon at the dedication ceremony. I almost said no. But in the end, I agreed. The day of the ceremony was bright and clear. A small crowd gathered, children, families, old farmers, and even a few faces from the past. As I stood at the podium, the wind lifted across the fields, bending the grass in soft waves. I didn't give a long speech. I just said, this land was never about ownership. It was about stewardship. We fought, we built, we broke, and we healed. And through it all, the land waited, patient as time itself. Now it belongs to everyone who listens. The applause was gentle, like rain on dry soil. When I stepped down, I noticed a young boy near the fence, holding a notebook, scribbling furiously. I smiled. Maybe he'd write about it someday. Maybe the story would live a little longer. That evening, I walked back along the creek, the same path I'd walked when this all began. The sun was setting low, and the light turned the water gold. I stopped near the old fence post where my grandfather had carved his initials decades ago. The letters were worn, almost invisible now. I traced them with my thumb and whispered, "It's done." For the first time in years, I felt light. When I finally went back to the house, I noticed something in the distance, the faint glimmer of lights from the community center. Kids were playing outside, chasing each other across what used to be a parking lot. Their laughter carried on the wind. That sound, not the courtroom victory, not the headlines, not the deed. That sound was the true reward. Because it meant the land was alive again. And if you listen closely, even now, you can still hear it breathe. Epilogue: the land speaks last. Time erases men. It erases fences, names, and signatures. But it never erases truth. The HOA's buildings may crumble one day. The roads may crack. The documents may fade. But the earth, the soil that remembers every hand that worked it, every wrong that scarred it, every justice that restored it, will still be here. Still whispering. Still waiting. Because the land always keeps the final record. It's been 10 years now. The valley looks nothing like it did when I first stood on the ridge watching the bulldozers tear through the soil. Where once there were half-finished offices and angry men with blueprints, there are now green roofs and open courtyards. The businesses that remained run on solar power and groundwater from the same creek they once tried to cage. People don't call it Ridgeview anymore. They call it Harlan Hollow. A name I never asked for, but one the land seemed to choose on its own. Every morning, I walk the same trail along Miller Creek. Mist rises from the water, the sun catches it, and the whole valley glows like breath made visible. Sometimes children wave from the footbridge that crosses the stream. They don't know the battles buried under their sneakers. There's a plaque at the bridge now. It reads simply, "Here, the land was heard." Nothing more. No titles. No courts. Just truth in 6 words. Inside the library I built, the shelves have grown heavier. Farmers, students, and historians leave journals, diaries, and photographs, small fragments of the valley's memory. What began as my family's story has become everyone's. One section is devoted to the years of dust, the period when the HOA ruled these acres. I never removed those documents. The petitions, the fake zoning forms, the letters of threat, they remain sealed behind glass. I wanted people to see what arrogance looks like when it's written down. Every now and then, visitors lean close and whisper, "I can't believe this really happened." I always smile. It always happens, I think. Only the names change. This spring, a young woman came to see me. She was a law student from the university in the next county. Her hands trembled as she unfolded a stack of papers. "Judge Harlan," she said, "I've been researching your case for my thesis. But I don't understand one thing. Why didn't you just stop them before they built? You had the documents." I looked at her for a moment, then pointed out the window toward the fields. "Do you see that grass?" She nodded. "If you cut it too soon, it never learns how to bend with the wind. You wait. You let it grow tall enough to remember the storm. That's what I did." She stared at me like she was hearing something half myth, half lesson. Then she wrote it down word for word. Maybe someday she'll teach it. Not all endings are clean. The HOA never fully disappeared. It dissolved and reformed as a community board. They meet every quarter under the same roof where the first illegal plans were signed. But now, every chair is open to the public. Every vote recorded. Every voice counted. Last year they invited me to give the keynote address. I declined, politely. Then, to everyone's surprise, I showed up anyway, just to listen. A middle-aged man stood at the podium presenting new proposals for flood control and sustainable irrigation. Behind him hung a large photo of the creek in flood, taken the night the dam overflowed during the old battles. He pointed to it and said, "We learned from our mistakes because someone forced us to." He didn't look at me, but he didn't have to. I knew what he meant. Sometimes, in the still of late summer, I visit the upper ridge where my father's and grandfather's names are carved into a weathered cedar post. I bring a chair, sit, and watch the horizon melt into gold. I talk to them aloud, the way I used to when I was younger. "You were right, Dad. The land always knows. It just needed someone patient enough to listen." The wind answers by bending the grass and whispering through the branches. That's all the reply I ever need. I've left instructions for what happens when I'm gone. The library will stay open, free for everyone. The land trust will pass to the community council. No new construction without public approval. No corporate ownership, no fences cutting the valley in half. My ashes will be mixed into the soil near the creek, back where everything started. It feels right to return as dust to the ground that outweighted everyone. Sometimes I wonder about Richard Keene. He never came back after that letter, but I heard rumors he works for environmental nonprofits now, helping restore damaged land. Perhaps that's the truest punishment, learning to heal what you once hurt. If I ever see him again, I think I'd thank him. Without his arrogance, none of this would exist: the library, the park, the laughter echoing across the hollow. Even the mistakes have roots that feed tomorrow. Last week, a child came running up to me near the creek. She couldn't have been more than 7. "Mr. Harlan," she shouted, "our teacher says this land used to belong to you." I crouched down, smiling. "No," I said. "It belongs to you. To everyone who respects it." She grinned and ran back toward the bridge, shoes splashing through shallow water. I watched her go, sunlight dancing on the ripples, and I realized something my father probably knew all along. Justice isn't a verdict. It's a seed. You plant it, protect it, and then step aside. As the evening settles, I return home and sit on the porch. The wind carries the scent of cedar and damp earth. Somewhere down the valley, an owl calls once, twice, then silence. The stars rise slow over Harlan Hollow. The lights from the old business park glimmer faintly in the distance, reminders that even the proudest structures bow to time. I close my eyes and breathe. The earth beneath my feet feels warm, alive. The same soil that once carried my grandfather's boots and my father's plow now carries my peace. And in that stillness, I finally understand. The land never needed to be claimed. It just needed to be remembered. Epilogue: the land that waited. When people tell this story now, they focus on the victory. The court case. The headlines. The drama. But what they miss is the quiet after the storm, the part where the land healed, and a man learned to listen again. That's the real ending. No gavel. No applause. Just the sound of wind through grass. And a valley that remembers every name it ever carried.